How good are the NFL at fantasy football? Hit rates based on the NFL draft. Buckle up. So here are your basic hit rates for players getting at least just one top 12 season. So Blake Bortles counts, Eric Ebron counts at the tight end position. It's a fairly low threshold for fantasy relevance, but it's a good overview of how likely players are to be somewhat, in fact vary through that 1 year, very fantasy relevant after they're drafted from the NFL. So in the first round, you'll notice that tight ends have the highest hit rate, but only 5% of all tight ends drafted within the first 7 rounds, or the 7 rounds of the NFL draft, are actually drafted in the first round. And tight ends hit for about 88% of the time for at least one top 12 season. Again, that can look like Eric Ebron happening very late and slightly disappointingly, and by the time it actually occurs, but still, that's the rate. They're the highest hit rate group from the first round. Running backs are next, with 66% of them drafted in the first round, getting at least one top 12 season. Notice also that for every position, the first round is the least common draft round for all players drafted at that position in the NFL, which makes sense, except for quarterback, where the majority of quarterbacks taken in the NFL draft are going to be taken in the first round. So yeah, quarterbacks are by and large drafted in the first round, and tight ends hit the most commonly with first round draft capital. Next is running back, and then it's quarterback. Wide receivers have a consistently below average hit rate no matter what round you're looking at, but it is fairly at least homogenous from one round to the next. There's a higher expectation in the first round, with 28% of them getting at least one top 12 season, and 20% of them having at least one top 12 season if drafted in the second round, from all players drafted from that particular round, not of the overall draft. It's also worth noting that those numbers somewhat equalize at wide receiver if you start looking at top 24 players, which is a more accurate boundary for wide receivers, since 24 wide receivers are actually a better category, but I just wanted to stick with the same one. So there are some kinks in the overall hit rates here, which are probably worth mentioning. When you're looking at a round by round basis of hit rates by position, you notice that quarterbacks drafted in the 4th round hit a little higher or produce a top 12 season at slightly higher rate than quarterbacks drafted in the 3rd round, which doesn't follow the general logic of being drafted higher is better than being drafted lower. And this is basically a product of small sample variance, I think, but it is worth noting that Kirk Cousins, Dak Prescott were both drafted in the 4th round, whereas only Russell Wilson, with at least one top 12 season, was drafted in the 3rd round, and those are really the hits that are creating those averages. At wide receiver, we'll see that players in the 5th round actually hit a little more often for at least one top 12 season than players drafted in the 4th round, and so that's a little against the general pattern of being drafted higher being better than being drafted lower as well. It's worth noting that since 2012, Marvin Mims, Stephon Diggs, and Hunter Renfrow were all drafted in the 5th round, and Darnell Mooney is also in the 5th round, but he only has one top 24 seasons so far, so he actually doesn't count on that hit rate. Whereas in the 4th round since 2012, only Amon-Ra St. Brown has top 12 seasons with 4th round draft capital, and that's what's creating the disparity between the 4th and the 5th round at wide receiver. It is interesting, but generally when you see something going against a more broad trend, and you know there's a sample size problem, or at least a limited sample size. So the next thing to think about is the general correlation of fantasy pick better than the general correlation of draft round? Based on my most recent data, draft pick does actually correlate higher to points per game through the first 3 years than draft round. So ideally, a player with a lower draft number being picked first overall or first in the 2nd round is being better than picked last overall in the 1st round or in the 2nd round. But we can actually dig in a little further than that to see where the trends may exist, if they have any relevance at all, by position. I'll try and include this table in the database so that you can all get a look at it, but bear in mind that the percentages can be remarkably confusing when sometimes you only look at 2 or 3 players, or even sometimes 1 player or 0 players being drafted at a specific position. Hit rate's so terrible in general, or at least it's a microcosm for it. But one thing I did want to note is that while quarterbacks hit at a fairly high rate in the 1st round, the vast majority of them are selected through the first 3. And since 2012, the first overall pick has been a quarterback 63% of the time. It's been a quarterback in the 2nd pick 45% of the time, and a quarterback 27% of the time at the 3rd overall pick, which is the highest among all positions. And what I'd also point out is that these hit rates get kind of messy when you're looking at an individual pick basis, because this 100% is kind of misleading versus this 100%, depending on exactly how many players were drafted at that exact pick. but it is an interesting table to try and look for those general patterns. However, the typical way of doing this is bucketing them into different sections of the round, like this. So if we dig into the specific draft rounds and bucket it a little bit, it's worth noting that percent of all quarterbacks drafted in the NFL are drafted within the first 16 picks of the NFL draft, and they have a 63% hit rate within the first 16 picks. And actually, if we zoom out just a little bit and go to the top of the table, we can see that actually pretty much the top 12 picks are all a little bit different than players drafted outside the top 12. While we do have still a pretty decent drafted rate at some picks, after pick 12, I think that hit rate and that commonality of quarterbacks being drafted within the first 16 picks is really limited to the top 12 if we actually just run a judicious eye over it, and because we see the numbers drop off after that point. And it's the same with the hit rates. You'll notice that everyone drafted by pick 12, pretty much the hit rates at each individual pick are fairly high and fairly consistent, with a few misses at the second and third overall. Another way of thinking about that is 27 were drafted in the first 16 picks, but only 15 were drafted in the first 3 picks. So the vast majority of the sample size in that first 16 pick bucket are coming through the first 3 picks. Through the top 12, we're seeing an overwhelming majority of players who are already being drafted that are counting in that bucket. So I actually think you could separate out the top 3 from the top 12 and the top 12 from everyone else at the quarterback position in the first round. In the first round at the wide receiver position, we see that 50% of all wide receivers drafted in the first round are drafted within the first 16 picks, so it's pretty much an even split between the top half and the bottom half of the first round. But only 37% of players drafted in the first 16 picks actually hit for a top 12 season, and that's relatively consistent with players that are drafted in the final 16 picks of the first round that has a 26% hit rate. It is better to be drafted earlier in the first round at wide receiver position, but there's less of a disparity between the first round and the top half of the first round and the back half of the second round at wide receiver than most other positions. It's also worth noting, however, that discrepancy could mislead. There is a higher likelihood of hitting at the wide receiver position if you're drafted for the first 16 picks. If you ever have trouble remembering that, just remember N'Keal Harry was drafted in the final pick of the first round, and DK Metcalf was drafted at the first pick overall in the second round, I think. Also note that these hit rates would have led you in the exact wrong direction if you were just using hit rates to decide between N'Keal Harry and DK Metcalf. N'Keal Harry was being drafted in a range in the NFL draft that hits 26% of the time, and DK Metcalf was being drafted in a range that hits 19% of the time. So hit rates are hit rates, don't get carried away with them. It's also worth noting again when looking at the tight end position that 100% and 83% hit rate looks really good until you realize there's only about 5% of tight ends drafted within the NFL draft are actually selected in this high in the first round. Like 3 players have been drafted through the first 16 picks at the position. It's not very common. Travis Kelce wasn't, Rob Gronkowski wasn't, Jimmy Graham wasn't, and only 6 players were drafted in the back half of the first round. So while it's a pretty good hit rate, not necessarily the best tight ends come from the top 16 picks. The second round is slightly more interesting for a few different reasons. 51% of running backs drafted in the NFL through the first 7 rounds at least, whereas 48% have been drafted in the top half of the second round, and yet that top half are hitting more regularly for top 12 seasons for fantasy. The wide receiver position, just like running back, they're being taken more often in the second half of the second round. Do they hit at a different rate? Not really. Again, wide receiver hit rates are fairly consistent in the top half versus the back half of the second round in the NFL draft. There's not a lot of discrepancy between a 20 and a 19% hit rate, especially when considering these sample sizes. Tight ends, do you hit more regularly if you're drafted in the first 16 picks versus the second 16 picks in the second round? Again, not really. There's no real discrepancy. And if you're drafted at the back of the second round or the start of the second round, that doesn't really put you in a different hit rate category. You shouldn't really have different expectations outside of what you think of the actual player. Digging into the third round a little bit, you see that running backs hit better if they're drafted earlier in the third round. It's the same for running backs and quarterbacks and wide receivers. They're definitely hitting at a higher rate if drafted in the first 16 picks of the third round instead of the back 16 picks of the third round. Tight ends, weirdly, it's better to be drafted in the back half of the third round than the first half of the third round, based on these hit rates, because 33% of players drafted in the back half of the third round actually hit for at least one top 12 season, versus 0% in the first half. So is it better to be drafted in the back half of the third round if you're a tight end? Jordan Reed, Mark Andrews, Dawson Knox, and Austin Hooper, who were all drafted outside of pick 80, inside the third round, which means technically they're a back half of the third round, and they have all been great for fantasy. At which point it's worth noting that Travis Kelce was drafted at the 63rd overall pick, but technically inside round 2? Inside round 3? But that would make the number of picks that happen. It was weird. The draft is weird, okay? 32 picks don't always happen within an individual round. So technically, if I adjust for Travis Kelce, 10% of players have hit for a top 12 season within the top half of the third round. But he was drafted at pick 63 overall, which makes that a little awkward. So where does that leave us? Alright, general trends, it's better to be drafted earlier than later. That's just common sense. But there are some interesting ranges, especially at quarterback and especially at tight end, that seems to offer different hit rates. And also there's just always a side note that wide receiver hits at a lower rate no matter where you're looking at most other positions, except that wide receiver hit rates tend to remain fairly consistent all the way through the first 3 rounds. So it's better to be drafted early than later, but by the time you get to the second round and the third round, running backs and tight ends drafted deeper into those rounds are less likely to hit than wide receivers drafted deeper into those rounds. While running backs drafted in the top half of the second round hit for about a 50% rate, and wide receivers only hit for a paltry 19%, by the time you get to the back half of the second round, running backs are no longer hitting anywhere close to that 50% rate. In fact, they're hitting closer to that 20% rate that wide receivers were hitting on. And wide receivers are still hitting in the NFL for fantasy at the same 20% rate. So wide receivers are a little more consistent through the rounds than running backs or tight ends or quarterbacks. Outside of that, the interesting ranges are mostly at quarterback. Inside the top 3 picks and inside the top 12 picks are very different types of picks. I don't know. I don't work for NFL teams, but I will say it has been a feature of draft capital for the NFL and fantasy that players drafted outside of round 3 are pretty much one synonymous group for me. Teams seem to be trying to fill skill position roles, so the first 3 rounds at a much more common rate than outside the first 3 rounds, where they're trying to draft special teamers or camp bodies or players they may want to develop. Antonio Brown was drafted in that range, for example, but also Adam Thielen and the other undrafted free agents like Austin Eckler at a different position. Outside of that, one of the things I always notice is that it's remarkably obvious how diverse the wide receiver position is compared to other positions. You can see that just in the numbers of players drafted. Whether it's early or late in an individual round, there's almost a constant double-digit sample size of wide receivers being drafted. Well, the NFL is constantly taking shots at the position that we're calling wide receiver. Outside of that, if you're looking for general trends to latch a hold on, very marginal edges that potentially are just a product of sample size and historical circumstance, but are fun hills to stand on, 5th round wide receivers, 4th round quarterbacks, let's get it.